Now we saw use cases for how to use Git locally for development, how to execute different commands, how to manage the Git repository, and so on. Now the question is, when or for which use cases you would need Git as a DevOps engineer? The first use case is when working with infrastructure as code concept. So, for example, if you are working with a developer team that is deploying their application to Kubernetes, for example, you would be probably responsible for creating various Kubernetes configuration files, and these files have to be managed somewhere, right? So let's say you have files for creating volumes, for deploying some databases. Maybe you have your Helm charts for applications. So a lot of different configuration files that you may need in Kubernetes. In addition to that, let's say your Kubernetes cluster is deployed on AWS, right? And in order to communicate with AWS and to manage the service on AWS, you don't do that manually, but rather use automation tools like Terraform. And maybe you also use Ansible for deployment. And Terraform and Ansible configuration are also in form of configuration files. And let's say in addition, you have some scripts, like some bash scripts and Python scripts configured for various tasks. Now, all of those are files that you probably change over time, and you also need some kind of tracking, some history of what has changed in those files, but also some place where all of these files are stored securely in one place instead of just laying around on your local computer, right? And that's only if you're working alone as one person who is managing all this stuff. But usually you would probably be part of a DevOps team where you have 2, 3, maybe even more DevOps engineers working and managing the same infrastructure together. And that would mean that you would need some kind of collaboration to work on the Terraform files, on Ansible configuration files, to write the scripts, and so on. So just like developers are working on the same code base and synchronizing and communicating with each other, you as a DevOps team would need some kind of collaboration on those configuration files. So you would use Git repository for that. So that's part of the infrastructure as code concept. So you don't manually manage the infrastructure, but rather you write scripts or some automated workflows to manage the infrastructure. And that is represented in files, in code, and that is then stored, hosted on Git repositories. That's the first use case for why you would need Git as a DevOps engineer. The second use case is when you are working with CI/CD pipeline or generally a build automation tool. So the basis of build automation or continuous integration, continuous delivery pipeline is that you check out the application code, you test it, you build the application based on that code, and you do some other stuff with it. So this means that you need integration of that build automation tool with the code, the application code Git repository, and you also may need some Git commands specific for build automation tool. So to examine these 2 points in more detail, you as a DevOps engineer may be responsible in some cases to set up integration between the build automation tool and a Git repository. And depending on the build automation tool and depending on the Git repository, the integration may be different. So having some kind of experience and understanding the concepts of how this integration works is, of course, very important. And we're going to learn that, of course, in more detail and see that in action in the build automation module. And another part that I mentioned is Git commands specific to build pipeline. And some of the examples of such commands can be, for example, getting a commit hash of a specific commit, for example, the last commit. It could be, for example, checking whether changes have happened in front-end code or in back-end code in order to decide whether to run tests for that part and so on. So these are some of the examples, and this is for you to understand where you would need Git as a DevOps engineer. But as I mentioned, we're going to see both scenarios using Git for Jenkins CI/CD pipeline and using Git repository for infrastructure as code tools in action in later modules.